using S to drive your ESG strategy and practices. And if you are here today, I think we can safely assume that you recognise the importance of social considerations, or perhaps you simply want to learn more. One factor our panel all have in common is that they're all extremely passionate about the S in ESG and want to share their expertise, so you have takeaways back to your organisations to ensure social impacts of actions and activities are being considered and responded to. We want to encourage these considerations to be viewed as opportunities to create value for employees, customers, shareholders, and communities to have more sustainable and resilient business practices. I hope many of you have seen the Modern Slavery webinar the FSC facilitated. Modern Slavery, what is it? Why should we care? And what should we do about it? We hosted back in March. If you haven't, I'm Carissa Perano, the Head of Regulatory Affairs at the FSC. Please drop me an email, and our panel hope that today's session will build on this educative journey on wider S and ESG topics under this huge umbrella. So I'm delighted to welcome our expert panel today and our facilitator, Rebecca Kingi from ANZ, who will be taking us through this educative journey today. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, Carissa. And kia ora, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, that's great. Well, firstly, I want to say congratulations for being in this room, because I think that you've chosen the best session of the conference. So well done you. And to echo Carissa's comments, this area is something that personally I'm incredibly passionate about. Throughout my career, I've worn a few different hats, and one of those hats has been as a legal practitioner and representative of survivors of human rights abuses, particularly modern slavery and human trafficking. So I've seen firsthand the impact on humans like you and me, when private entities don't have S as a core part of the way that they do business. And I've also seen the positive impact on human beings when they do. So I think it's really exciting that we're here in this room to discuss this. And I think it's also really exciting that we have the panel lineup that we do to take us through this conversation. It's a real privilege to introduce them to you. So we have here Gemma Livingston from KPMG, and Gemma brings an extensive amount of experience. Actually, they all do, and they're going to dazzle us throughout this conversation. I'm not going to give you big, cheesy bios because it's going to be pretty evident what all these experts have to say. But we also have Oliver Christeller with us from the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, which is fantastic timing because there's just been a very recent Human Rights Commission report come out about the risk of and instances of migrant exploitation and modern slavery in Aotearoa. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And we also have with us Andrew Jamieson from PwC. So thank you for all of our panellists for being here. And I don't want to take up too much of your time before we actually get into the real weeds of what we're talking about today, but I will just touch on questions and dialogue and conversation. I want to recognise there's actually a lot of expertise also in this room, and it would be great to sort of open up the conversation and have a bit of an opportunity to ask questions and have feedback. Please do send them through. I understand there's a sort of app system that Carissa is completely across, luckily for me. And what we are going to do, though, is we're going to touch on them at the end of the session, just because chances are our panellists will probably cover off some of the things that are raised throughout our conversation. Right, so we'll move on now swiftly to a video introduction.
The S of ESG stands for social. It's about the social impacts that organisations have, both directly and indirectly, on stakeholders in their operations and throughout their value chain. Stakeholders like an organisation's employees, their customers and clients, workers and local communities throughout their supply chain. In a word, it's about people. And because people are complex, there are many different aspects to the S of ESG. From organisational culture, health and safety and worker well-being, through to sustainable finance and supply chains. From DEI and accessibility, through to Indigenous Te Ao Māori perspectives. From social return on investment to new emerging areas like the ethical use of AI and the concept of just transition. And of course, another critical aspect of the S of ESG is the topic we are discussing today, modern slavery.
Modern slavery is an umbrella term that's used to describe a range of exploitative practices, including forced labour, forced marriage, debt bondage, slavery, and human trafficking. Though not formally defined in international law, modern slavery is referenced in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and global efforts are needed to meet the target to eradicate it. As such, efforts to combat modern slavery form part of corporate, sustainable and responsible decision-making and actions falling within environmental social governance, including for the financial services sector.
Kia ora tātou. New Zealanders are connected to modern slavery through the goods that they purchase and the services that they use. World Vision's Risky Goods report showed that last year the average Kiwi household spends around $77 a week on goods that are linked to child enforced labour. This amounts to around $7.9 billion per annum, or around 10% of all of New Zealand's imports. I really encourage you to read the Risky Goods report. It really identifies what goods are at high risk of modern slavery. Top of the list, though, is electronics. And it's not lost on me that the gadgets that are fueling our iPhones, our wind farms, our e-bikes are the very ingredients that are exploiting people, children, mined for a lot of the materials that are in these products. And the manufacturer is also very high risk of modern slavery. Please read our report and let us know if you've got any questions. Have a great conference.
Well, slavery and exploitation are not just an overseas problem. It's a systemic issue across New Zealand, and it affects all of our industries. This is evidenced by the amount of phone calls we've been and have and always have received through our help line, through a charity we're associated with, and the compliance work or investigation work we do with or across different industries. Exploitation, modern slavery should be considered in day-to-day operations and supply chains for all businesses, and it should be at the forefront of their day-to-day because of the implications that we'll have going, and the fact that our industries are being used as vessels for organised crime, and these offences are committed against people, and they're committed against different legislations, whether it's money laundering or health and safety breaches. This is why guidelines, ESG, aren't enough anymore, or goes beyond them, and it is more of a compliance issue or an investigative response, or even better, preventing it at the front end. Financial services have a huge part to play in this, whether it is in the insurance game or loans to businesses or finance to businesses, or in shares or the ownership of a business to start making it a priority to reduce the risk to the victims that industries are creating, because it's of how easy it is for these unethical or unscrupulous employers to operate within them.
Kia ora tātou, ko Kylie Silmanu tōku ingoa. I'm the head of irregular migration and trafficking in persons at Immigration New Zealand, and I am incredibly grateful to have been given the opportunity to speak with you all today, albeit remotely. And I just want to extend my gratitude and thanks to the panel of experts that you have in front of you to raise awareness and understanding of modern slavery in Aotearoa. I wish I could say that I had good news, but the reality is that modern slavery and trafficking in persons happens here in Aotearoa. Over the last year, we've certified 16 victims here in Aotearoa, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Unfortunately, we are finding people in some really dire circumstances, whether that be in cases of domestic servitude, forced labour, sexual exploitation, or forced marriage. These challenges are very real and happening. What I'd like to say, though, is that it's not just our migrant communities who we are finding susceptible or vulnerable, it's actually New Zealanders as well. And with profits estimated in the mark of $150 billion per annum, what we're looking at here is significant profit for transnational organised crime syndicates who are really seeking to exploit the most vulnerable in our communities. So I have a couple of asks, and those asks are really to understand what this might look like in your supply chains, what it might look like in your front of house operations, in your systems, and make sure that we are all doing our part to make our system and our country as resilient as possible. So the onus is on all of us to make sure that we do what we can to protect those who need us the most. So thank you, enjoy your panel, and take what you can, because I think it starts now and we really need to put our heads together to focus our energy in the right places. Ka kite anō.
Tēnā koutou, tātou whalawa. I am Sauno Mali Karanina Sumbeo, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner here at Te Kāhui, Tika, Tangata, the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. We are the national human rights institutions for Aotearoa. We advocate for and promote human rights in New Zealand, and we're also part of the International Human Rights Network of institutions that help to uphold human rights on a global scale. Now, your role as financial services in Aotearoa is really, really important, because we know that you support businesses, you advise businesses on what is good for them, and also you provide the finances to enable them to operate. Unfortunately, we know that in New Zealand, modern slavery is occurring. We know this, we have seen it through our inquiries through the seasonal worker scheme, the RSE schemes, as well as through the accredited work visa scheme. And we have been calling alongside many others, including World Vision and others, for modern slavery legislation to be brought into Aotearoa. Certainly last year, when New Zealand was reviewed at United Nations, and it's the Universal Periodic Review, recommendations were made by a number of our global trading partners, including Brazil and Mexico and the United Kingdom, for us to consider looking at introducing specific modern slavery legislation. And certainly we need the help of the financial services to call on our government to look at bringing that urgently. We know that we're, as a country, we believe in fairness, we believe in the dignity of all peoples, regardless of how they come to New Zealand, regardless how they're going to stay here. We are human first. So please add your support to the cause of government to introduce specific modern slavery legislation. It's good for our businesses, it's good for our communities, it's good for our international reputation, and it's good for human rights.
I've got a couple of slides here that just show some of our exposure to this. And I think, well, firstly, is there anything more awkward than watching yourself on video? No. But we're in the same outfit, sustainable. We'll breeze past that. But I think as much as that video is quite heavy in content, for me it's also hopeful in two ways. I think the first thing is it's very encouraging that the dialogue in Aotearoa has shifted from perhaps a culture of disbelief that modern slavery could happen here to now an understanding that it absolutely does, and what are we going to do about it. And I think the second thing that is hopeful, and it was touched on, is that the financial services sector has a part to play in this, and actually it's quite an exciting challenge to think about the opportunity that presents. We're going to touch on that in more depth, but I think I would like to sort of firstly ask our panellist Gemma to comment really on what this looks like in the New Zealand landscape, especially in the current absence of modern slavery legislation that requires entities to look at due diligence in their supply chains and operations.
Is this working? Yeah. Hi, everyone. I firstly want to start by saying this is the S of ESG, so we are not going to focus just on modern slavery. However, it is so interconnected. So when we look at human rights due diligence, it sits across business, and modern slavery is one of those pieces of regulation at the moment that has been brought in around the globe, and the regulation looking within New Zealand as well. But it is not a standalone issue. So when we talk about modern slavery, we're talking about child labour, forced labour, we are talking about basic human rights and the way people are treated, trafficking, debt bondage, all these different activities that do fit within our human rights resilience as well. So basic business practice, and there is current legislation that fits around modern slavery activity, criminal activity within New Zealand, but by having a modern slavery framework, it puts the onus on businesses to respect, to act as they are meant to under members and international treaties and the United Nations UNGP's guiding principles on business and human rights. Sorry, I'm going to avoid acronyms. For the framework in New Zealand at the moment, it won't be lost on you. I'm sure that there was a promise that legislation was coming. Legislation is not here. It's been drafted. It's deemed to be not fit for purpose. National said it's not a priority at this time. However, they haven't said it's not coming. Because the reality is, in the global market that we're working, it doesn't matter whether New Zealand has legislation or not. It's changing for businesses, especially in the financial services sector, because of investor pressure. Because we are an international trade country, we cannot trade globally if we are not upholding human rights. And there is increasing legislation globally that is putting the emphasis on human rights. Your corporate social sustainability due diligence directive in the EU, changes within Australia in terms of their modern slavery legislation looking towards due diligence, frameworks from investors, not just in countries that we trade with, but countries that are important for our trade as a whole. So in a global economy, yes, human rights, modern slavery legislation within New Zealand, very important. It's not is it coming, it's a when is it coming. And what will that look like? I think the frameworks we can look to is it doesn't matter necessarily what it looks like for New Zealand businesses, it matters what it looks like from in a global economy.
So I think summarising that, it's almost talking about the drivers around modern slavery risk and activity remain for New Zealand because of the global landscape that we're working in, that many of the entities that are customers in this sector are work at the world that they're working in. I think it would be really helpful, Oliver, to get some insight from you from the work that the Human Rights Commission has recently done and the broader work that you do around this. Also noting we're going to dive a little bit later into broader S and the Human Rights Commission's expertise on that, because it's important for us to understand what's actually happening on our own shores. And often there's sort of, I know Rebecca Armstrong touched on it, we kind of can picture a global connection through supply chains in areas that we consider high risk. But what's actually happening here in New Zealand, and why is that a relevant risk for us in this room?
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Rebecca. Recently, we've looked at a number of areas where I think there's modern slavery in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Towards the end of 2022, we did a report into the recognised seasonal employer scheme, which is the migrant worker from the Pacific Island, fruit picking, viticulture, horticulture sector. And there are a number of areas in which there's migrant exploitation there. Some very big concerns about deductions of wages. I think there's a case called Suapi that's going through the employment court at the moment. And it's quite an interesting case, not only to this particular legal issue around deductions of wages, but you can actually see some broader human rights issues that aren't the legal issues in those cases. We were approached actually by a financial institution last year who was working in the rural sector, and they were asking us around what they could be doing to ensure that their customers are not participating, or that they can look at mitigating that. So I think it was really encouraging to see that when we put out some work that there are some really responsible people in the financial sector who are proactively saying, what can we do? And I think there is that bit of work and the things that I suppose the Commission is interested to work with anyone who wants to work and improve their human rights record in that space. More recently, we've done a report into the accredited employer work visa, which is New Zealand's largest temporary migrant worker visa. And some of those things that are happening under that visa are quite shocking. So we're seeing a lot of offshore payments, premiums for employment between sort of $10,000 and $60,000. People are arriving not having a job or being told to work in a job that breaches their visa condition. They're tied to the particular employer, so that leaves a lot of area for exploitation and a power dynamic that's not healthy. And we also seen a lot of problems with housing as well for those workers, and obviously a wider condition of some stress on housing in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I think where that might sort of impact on people in the financial sector is obviously if you're a bank or you've got relationships. Those are part of almost all sectors of the society they touch on. And the other place I think is really important is to look into some of the subcontracting arrangements, and that might be whoever you're subcontracting with. For example, one of the workers I spoke to had a really harrowing story, was working in the security industry. Many people in the financial sector are engaging directly security. So what are we doing to look at our own arrangements with subcontractors, how we ensure upholding human rights in those arrangements, and also sort of looking into the customer space. So there's a lot that the financial sector can be doing, and a lot that people are doing. The Commission wants to be a resource for people to have discussions about human rights and promote and protect human rights. And if I can just very quickly comment, I really support the things that Gemma was saying about the modern slavery legislation. Yes, we've been told it's delayed, but it will be coming. And for me, it's about not just about getting any legislation, but getting effective legislation. So I suppose I like to take a glass half full perspective. I think this is an opportunity now for people who care about this spaces really to get that legislation right, to ensure it's effective and it's going to actually do what we want to do, and it's not just a piece of legislation that says we're addressing. And from the Commission's perspective, that includes ensuring that it has a broad coverage of business, that it includes due diligence.
Thank you, Oliver. I think it's really helpful, I think, to be able to practically conceptualise what it is we're talking about when we talk about these issues in New Zealand. And it's a really good example about how we need many stakeholders at the table, including the Human Rights Commission and including the government, because, from ANZ's perspective, we want our customers to be set up for success, to do business in New Zealand. And that means to be able to operate in a way that minimises risks to them, enables them to access global markets. And I think if there is ever going to be regulation in New Zealand around this, it's important that it's there to set businesses up for success, that it gives them the guidance and support that's required to actually do modern slavery or broader human rights due diligence and transparency. And I think, but tapping back onto what Gemma was saying, sort of regardless of whether we get this law or it comes in, there are other factors that are driving this activity, and you said, Gemma, specifically one of them is expectations from investors. And actually I'd like to talk to our esteemed colleague from PwC about this, because I know you have a lot of expertise in this area. Can you sort of share what you're hearing from your clients and the work that you're doing?
Yes. And just very quickly, the very end of Oliver's statement I think is critical, is that the legislation as it comes out should contain due diligence as part of it, because that's the bit that's absent. So the law currently is not silent on these issues, it's just scattered. So there's the Minimum Pay Act, there's the Health and Safety at Work Act, there's about 5 different acts that we'll actually talk to, and the Crimes Act talks to slavery in particular, but they're not coherent, they don't coalesce, and they don't include that additional onus on organisations to provide confirmation that these issues don't exist. So it's more of a reactive legislation. Sorry, off piece. One of the easiest ways to talk about the drivers is to sort of the way that we see it in our practice is a pretty decent reflection of the drivers that our clients are facing when they ask us to look at these issues. They are in no particular order. We do a lot of work in due diligence, in vendor due diligence or buy-side due diligence in transactions, in order to look at where the risks are in organisations for modern slavery in their workplace. Sometimes that's very specific. So, for example, we have been involved in the transactions of a migrant worker recruitment business, for example. So very, very clearly high exposure. Very, very clearly, you need to do not just the diligence on policies, processes and controls, but you actually need to look under the hood to figure out actually are we seeing what we need to see from the direct from the people who are the migrant workers. We see it in to the point earlier about subcontractors, people like gentailers who end up having quite a broad subcontractor base through their workforce in construction and infrastructure building. The directors of those companies want to know where are the risks in their supply chain for mistreatment of workers or mispayment of workers. Sometimes that will just be from a policy, procedures and controls point of view, but ideally actually it's a little bit further under the hood than that. We have come across, for example, in fact, in an instance of a large insurer had us looking through not just the S part of it, but their entire ESG policies and processes. We found they had an ethical supplier code of conduct. Basically, the way it was written, everybody should have been B Corp certified, effectively. And so when you go to them and you go, do you enforce this? Do you do any sample testing, or is this literally just a piece of paper and they're like, actually, to be honest, it's a piece of paper? Fine. Then you don't have that because it's not true, and it'll actually, if it comes to light, it'll make you look even worse. Actually come up with a policy on your code of conduct that you either enforce or sample test, or at least test when people are coming onto your procurement pathways. Some other drivers have been spoken about. There's a lot of changes in the international regulatory landscape, which we're seeing. Even people like MFAT are really struggling to keep up with it. There was an act that was passed last year called, handily, very catchy, the S211 Act in Canada. It's the first cross-border act which actually puts the onus of the obligation onto the importer in Canada or the exporter to Canada to prove that there's no child labour or modern slavery in their supply chain. So that's a product that's actually a very small, quite arcane piece of legislation, but actually telling that countries are starting to get a bit more bolshy about putting the onus on people outside of the country. And it was mentioned earlier, I think we both might have got it wrong, it's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD. CSRD, which impacts European organisations, the size of them is actually quite low for scale. There's a number of New Zealand entities that are captured either because of their parent or because of the amount of trade they're doing offshore, including people like Fonterra. CSRD has some parts in the first phase which is to do with ESG metrics in your own workforce, particularly under modern slavery. Going forward, it's actually starting to look more against the worker conditions in the supply chain. And there's kind of the standards are set up in pillars, which is not a bad way of zooming out a little bit, which is your own worker well-being and your worker conditions and payment and succession planning and capability building, all those good things. Then the workers in your supply chain that you have visibility of, then your societal obligations for the communities directly impacted by your economic activity, and then the users of your product. For financial services, it's like any part of the ESG spectrum. For financial services organisations, and I know you're not one thing, right? It's different for an insurer, as a bank, as an asset manager, or as a fintech provider. The sort of starting point is actually to figure out roughly what your exposure is, right? There's kind of there's a concentric circles of do no harm, figure out what your worker conditions are, quality job, succession planning, looking across your supply chain. For financial services in particular, heaps of stuff that we're going to hopefully talk about on product design, on product access, fees appropriateness, green leasing, those good things. I went way off piece there, sorry.
Oh, no, it's great. I think this is a conversation, isn't it? And we're trying to cover a lot. And sort of on that lens, let's go back to what Gemma was saying and kind of broaden this out. So broader than modern slavery, we have this concept of S in ESG. And I think sometimes it can almost feel overwhelming because so many things it can touch on. But let's reframe that to be like, it's not overwhelming. There are so many things which demonstrate actually how relevant it is to what we're doing. And the chances are we're already doing a lot of S activity as part of our BAU. Some things that we've raised already are things related to employment law. We've also got things about gender, pay equity. And I'd like to touch on your work again, Oliver, because the Human Rights Commission obviously has a really broad spectrum of work related to human rights. Can you talk about some of the other work that you do that's really relevant to us here in the room?
Yes, pay equity has been a big part of the Commission's work. In 2022, we completed a national inquiry into the Pacific pay gap. And so what that found is that Pacific workers, and particularly women workers, were the lowest paid in terms from a gender and ethnic perspective. And we try to do a lot of that work on an intersectional basis, so not just looking at gender or ethnicity by themselves. So I think Pacific women were earning 74 cents in what a $1 was for a Pākehā man. And what that meant over a career span was over $480,000 for that one worker over a 40-year career, was coming out of that woman's pay. And I think it's to think about that not only individually, but to think about what that means for Pacific communities. And we saw then, sorry, I have this, not the stats memorised, but Māori women were next, and then were there similar to Pacific men, and then it went forward and forward. And so Pākehā women were, I think, 9 cents in the dollar less than Pākehā men. So the gender pay gap is something that has got a lot of coverage. And I think over the last couple of years, people have been thinking about that a bit more intersectionally, about both gender and ethnic pay gaps. So Mind the Gap, who we've done a lot of work with, runs a public page where people can report, and I know I had a look on there today, and it was pleasing to see that a number of the financial services were reporting either on gender or ethnic pay gaps, and some of them on both. I think ANZ was reporting on both, Rebecca. And so I think it's really important then for people to be making those decisions, because if you're not measuring it, you can't make a plan, and if you're not making a plan, then you can't change those things. And one of the things I quite like to stress is that when we did, not only did we look at the pay gap, but we also looked at, had a little look at why is there a pay gap. And so for Pacific workers, over half of the pay gap was considered unexplained. So that meant it wasn't simply an issue of education levels or career choice, but that there are other factors coming into the reason why these workers weren't earning it. And one of those factors may well be discrimination. Certainly we did a lot of, as well as doing sort of statistical and economic work, we had individual conversations with workers, and there are a lot of themes that came through from Pacific workers saying, I've been here for a long time, I'm committed to the company, but I feel like I do my hours, I work hard, I contribute, but I'm not seen as the pathway to be put forward. And I think that's where a lot of the DEI policy comes in, and really good to see leadership in the DEI space, and for people to think about how can our company contribute to closing those things. There's some really good resources. One I saw recently came out from a group called Uptempo, who are somewhat affiliated with Auckland Council. I'm not quite sure the arrangement, but they put out something called the Great Employer Matrix, which if you're interested in, I'd encourage you to go online and have a look. And it gave really good advice, particularly around Pacific and Māori workers, and what good looks like, what great looks like, what excellent looks like, and some really good ideas. And I think there's sometimes a little bit of concern, I'm going to go and come up with a statistic that I don't like, I'm going to report it, and I think that's quite, for an organisation, I can feel like that could be a bit anxiety inducing, and I think the first step, if you're going to find out and you're going to report it, I think that's great. Don't feel embarrassed about what it looks like. Then you've got a baseline, and then it's about some simple steps you can do to move that forward. Rome wasn't built in a day, but certainly if we're thinking about it and we're trying to advance those issues and work through them. And the other part of that is that it's access to huge talent pool. There's great ingenuity. New Zealand is diversifying society, and if you can access the talent in diverse communities, I think that's a really strong incentive for businesses to do it.
I agree, and I think the exciting sort of opportunity from this is the way that we do work, the way we have our own employees reflected can then also reflect the services that we provide to the community. If we have more women in the finance sector, that's going to help more women access the finance sector, etc., etc. Sort of leading on from this, Gemma, can you unpack for us a little bit more? What are we practically talking about with S, leading on from what Oliver has said? And why do we not need to be scared of this concept? How is it actually BAU for us and something that we can make strides in?
I think leading on from what Oliver's just said and looking at equity and pay gaps and DEI, it fits in with everything we should be doing as a business anyway. It's no longer acceptable just to operate as a business without a consumer voice, an employer voice, an employee voice, a lived experienced voice. I would like to think we've matured as a country and as global to know that actually people matter, and if we don't put people in the middle of everything we're doing, we don't have a sustainable business. There's too much competition now within New Zealand to not consider consumer voice. Financial services, there's increasing pressure to have the social licence to operate. You've got too much pressure on you now not to consider this, but it shouldn't be overwhelming because you're already doing it. You're already considering regulatory change that you've got in your risk matrices, in your the health and safety work that you're doing, in your procurement that you have set up. There is policies and procedures and ways of working that are already there. It's just thinking, am I looking at the right things? Am I doing everything I should be in this space? So when we talk about the D&I, when we're talking about psychosocial hazards within the workplace, when we're talking about our well-being, customer vulnerability, when we're talking about modern slavery, we're not saying, hey, businesses, you need to go out and spend millions and change what you're doing overnight. It's knowing where your gaps are. It's knowing what your maturity is in these areas. It's the ESG, going back and looking at the materiality across all these things and saying, where are our weak spots? Where is there a risk to business if we're not addressing these weak spots? And actually, how do we integrate this? So instead of working in silos and having our loans team working over here doing some work and another team working over here, I'll use the example of child exploitation. Banks, they're having to address child exploitation, sexual abuse online. It's part of your AML reporting. It's a part of your financial crime reporting. If the financial crimes teams are doing work over here, but the ESG team is doing something completely different over here, and your investors and loan team are doing something over here, you're working in silos and you're not integrating your data, you're not integrating your training across the teams, across your business, then you've got a missed opportunity and you've got a risk. But if there's integration, if there's working groups, if there's training and internal, realising that actually the different parts of your business can be operating together in relation to ESG and these issues, you're saving yourself money and you're protecting human rights. And that's, I think, what we're talking about. We're not just talking about regulation, we're talking about business opportunity, not just business risk.
I can agree more. And I think I want to pick up on the word you said, that is the word silos. And something that I will say is a particular frustration of mine is how it's quite easy for us to silo the concept of human rights and human impact from the environmental and climate change work we do. And I know, Andrew, you have a lot of expertise across the board with sustainability. Could you speak to how actually these areas are complementary and how they are integrated?
Yep. I think there's a number of parallels. What we're seeing at the moment is, with the first instance of the climate-related disclosures in New Zealand, we're seeing quite a scale uptick in maturity and understanding of climate-related risks and opportunities amongst New Zealand organisations, not just the climate reporting entities, but their suppliers and their customers as well. One of the critiques of disclosures regimes is that it's just reporting, but actually you have to know it to show it. So for an organisation to even go through the process of disclosures means that they actually have to get a pretty integral understanding, particularly at board and exec level, of where the risks and opportunities for them sit. Where I was going to head on the S side of it is like rolling back a bit. ESG is not sustainability. ESG is basically the corporate interpretation of sustainability against metrics. So it's a framework by which you can measure your movement to progress against environmental, social and governance issues. With the S part of it, the being scared of the answer is not the answer. The answer is do a baseline in the first instance. Pick up any one of the disclosure regimes internationally, because it just gives you a framework mostly to demythologise it, to be able to go, actually, there's some things here that we can count. Workplace safety, payment, succession planning, and the quality of the jobs, like as in the technical quality of the jobs that we provide, which will allow you in the first instance to figure out where you sit maturity-wise, to then ask yourself, do we feel comfortable as an organisation with where we sit at the moment? We, for organisations with wider workforces or longer supply chains than the financial services sector normally has, there are lots of providers like And Wider and Ethical Voice, and I'm not paid by commission for either of these people, who can actually do really useful data polling up and down supply chains directly to workers to actually uncover where are the risks in your supply chain. So some of the work they've done is for KMD Group, for Kathmandu Group, and on their manufacturing and their distribution internationally to figure out, like they do a lot of stuff in Southeast Asia, are there actually risks to the workforce in there, or what we're being told about how the workers are being treated true? They've found stuff. So in New Zealand, the high risk areas are horticulture, seasonal workers, migrant workers, actually construction, because construction's got it's a very fragmented industry with a lot of contract workers amongst it. They've found things like with a horticulture group, one particular team, it happened to be, which was from one set of islands, the foreman of that group of workers were actually effectively tithing the workers to be able to repatriate money back to their village. And they wouldn't have known it unless they'd actually done the work to poll them directly and anonymously. Ethical Voice say in New Zealand, they are like it's a fantastic product, but they're saying, look, actually, what our problem is that people don't want to know the answer, because if you can't unask that question as soon as you asked it, which is exactly the wrong response. What organisations need to understand is if you do ask the question, then it's actually remediable. Like you're not going to uncover something that you can't solve. And certainly that's a whole lot better than the reputational risk of ending up on the front page of any newspaper. I think New Zealand businesses are also not naive, but you can get exited from an international market so quickly it'll make your head spin, right? Like literally, if you fall foul of these regulations, if Waitrose finds that there's reputational risk in dealing with your product, you'll be out of that market so quick. They don't care, right? It'll happen so fast. That's me. I was going to go, I think at some point, I think I'd be really interested to have a conversation about, particularly for this sector, the product design and the role that we've got in accessibility for financial services for New Zealand.
Are you taking a note of that, Carissa, for a future session? Because that sounds a very interesting conversation, I agree. I know, Gemma, you've got some thoughts to add to that as well.
I just want to add in terms of the point of not being afraid of it. So obviously in other countries they do modern slavery reporting, and a lot of, in fact, most financial services within New Zealand, but a lot of other clients that will be of the financial services report in Australia or the UK and other jurisdictions. And those modern slavery, although they're just reporting, they're public. So we can look at those, and I have reviewed, when I was working in Australia, I've reviewed thousands of those over the 3 years that they're there. People look at them and they're like, we can see that there's risks that have not been identified by these companies that are obvious risks or risks that we know occur. But where the companies are addressing risks or raising them and saying, this is a risk, we're aware of this risk, we're looking into this risk and these are the steps we're taking, is much more powerful from a consumer point of view. There is acknowledgement that nothing's going to change overnight in this space, but you cannot change things if you're not aware of those risks and then the opportunities to change those risks.
I did have another, there was one I wanted to make about the original question on the parallels with climate. With climate reporting, there's obviously like a large part of the impact is couched in carbon dioxide, right? So there's all the emissions reporting. The emissions reporting for financial services goes from scope 1 and 2, so the things that you emit as business owners, to scope 3. So scope 3 is financed emissions. So what are the activities that you're providing debt for that emit in your client base, and insured emissions? So effectively, what are the activities that your clients undertake that produce emissions that you're insuring? And there's a parallel here with capital flows, which is particularly for investee organisations. How do you know the activities and the surety of the workforce conditions in those businesses, unless you're actually doing some sort of due diligence to understand what the exposure to those organisations is. And Barry will probably help me out there, but you look at things like in the listed view at scale, the MSCI ESG ratings actually will show that people who have high S scores perform better, not just on a price point of view, but they actually perform better as an organisation. Just think of your slides were up earlier, Barry, on the...
Andrew, you touched on the point that I kind of want to end with before we touch on questions. I think the reality is we recognise that the financial services sector has a role to play as a stakeholder in this game, but we are not-for-profit organisations, we're not NGOs, and we have shareholder expectations around profit maximisation. In your experience, where actually is the work that we can do under S complementary to a profitable ambition?
So, firstly, in your own shops, then your own workforce is that's your priority. The data will also show that having high scores on S for your own workers make a more productive workforce. So that's true of professional services as it is of manufacture. The second part is that piece on the destination of capital and usage of capital is absolutely key. There's no way that any one of the organisations in this room is going to say profit over purpose, right? So you have an obligation to act profitability for the benefit of your shareholders. You do not have an obligation to direct capital unethically for the same purpose, right? So you're kind of fine with that one. You don't have to invest directly for social good. That is true. Although for the major banks, they all obviously have got some portion of funds that they're putting off. For example, and which I think is fantastic, the work that the big banks are doing to try and see off bad actors in payday lending, for example, and community banking, those sorts of things.
Gemma, do you have anything you want to add to that as well? It's good stuff, Gemma. It's good stuff. I like it.
You could add to it with the workplace bullying and harassment.
Take it away, Oliver.
Yeah, probably both of us got. The Human Rights Commission and KPMG recently released a joint report on bullying and harassment in the workplace, and it really demonstrated. I think we estimated the cost of bullying and harassment in Aotearoa is about $1.4 billion, as a conservative estimate. 1.5, excuse me. And so this is not. The reason we did that is not to say it's all about the finance, but it's to demonstrate the impact of these human rights considerations. We also demonstrated that it was disproportionately women who were experiencing bullying and harassment, and previous research that the Commission did that it was based on also spoke to it was disproportionately ethnic minorities, new migrants, and other vulnerable people, particularly disabled people, who were very vulnerable to bullying and harassment. So I think if you can address bullying and harassment in the workplace, it's going to both be a social good, increase productivity, and also reduce a lot of other costs that are associated with it. Gemma, did you want to comment further?
Yeah, I was just going to add that that's one issue. So the bullying and harassment is one issue, the workplace bullying and harassment. So we looked at that in terms of the cost of people leaving organisations because they don't want to work there anymore, the cost of people taking sick leave and more wellbeing leave and things, turning up but not actually doing the work that they need to be doing. And this was just the cost for a business as opposed to broader society. But what that connects into is the growth of psychosocial hazards, wellbeing, diversity, inclusion, accessibility within the workplace. So when we're talking about social at the moment and why we should be looking at it is because there's the direct cost to businesses from a consumer perspective. There's the direct cost from the retailer, the insurers, the overseas clients, the suppliers, but also the internal, the staff, your team, and that we can't deny that anymore. That there is a financial cost as well as wanting to do the right thing, right? Like we want to support people. I'm talking a lot about costs today. But there's the right reason, there's the heart reason to do it because it's the right thing to do, but there's the head thing to do because it makes financial sense to operate that this is a cost that we shouldn't be bearing anymore if you do the right thing.
Absolutely. When I was working in the UK around some of these issues and COVID hit, it became evident really quickly the disruption to businesses and entities when there weren't things in place already around health and safety and the fair treatment of their workers and workforce. And actually those policies and practices not only are appropriate to help your business to thrive in the moment, they're also preventative for things escalating further or when things happen that are outside of our control, which we absolutely know do all the time. So I want to give us some time for questions now, and I'll hand over to Carissa to lead that part. But again, I just want to say thank you to everyone that's come and been a part of this dialogue today, and I hope it is a continual conversation that we can have in the financial services sector in a way that we can also learn from each other along the way, because this, in my mind, is not a stagnant topic. It's a continually live topic. It's something that we continually need to be thought over, discussed, and worked on, because things are constantly changing in this space. The world we're living in is constantly changing. Thank you so much to our panellists for your expertise, and we're going to hear a little bit more, I'm sure, as we touch on these questions.
Yeah, there have been some interesting ones coming through, so thank you. Firstly, the wonders of technology. Apologies, Oliver, you are now up behind us. You mentioned Human Rights Commission reports and a national inquiry findings. Just wanted to cover off, are they publicly available?
Yeah, all of our documents will be available on our website. So I think I referred to at least 3 of our reports. So one was a really recent one about the accredited employer work visa.
Yep.
One was an earlier one about the RSE scheme. Both of those are human rights reviews, not inquiries. Which is really a shorter piece of work. An inquiry is actually a specific function that the Commission has under legislative function, and the Pacific Pay Gap inquiry met that legislative requirement, and so it's a very far deeper piece of work. So you can find a large report, a short report, various other academic papers that flew out of it. So but yeah, so yeah, please come onto our website, download our reports, share them. They're all publicly available. And the other one I mentioned was a Great Employer Matrix, which is up-tempo, which is very Googleable. I feel like I'm making up works.
Thanks. I'll throw this open to the panel. Should the FMA be doing more to investigate greenwashing in terms of the social part of ESG and managed funds?
Regulation in this space is hard and continuing. I'm not going to comment, I'm not going to answer whether the FMA should, but there will be more regulation focus. And I will say that actually the biggest drivers in Australia when I was there was not what the regulation was doing. It was suddenly front page of the newspaper from the reputational damage that was done. And so 7/11, that was where modern slavery legislation really came into before legislation was actually enacted, but the damage was done, and so there was suddenly an uplift of what was happening. A certain bank got done for not reporting the suspicious transactions in relation to child exploitation, but other AML type crimes that they were supposed to be reporting on. But it was the child exploitation that made the headlines, and that was what the emphasis for change within Australia was. I feel like, yes, there should be more of a focus on social because it is so integrated across how New Zealand acts as a business. But I also not sure the regulation can have teeth until we've got a legislation that they can tie it to.
Thank you, Gemma. Now, I just wanted to... So do you want to add something further? No? Okay. A thank you to Barry. And the end of the video, you would have seen some statistics that Mindful Money has provided. And that follows on to a question that Barry's provided, showing, given those charts show a significant level of investment, and my iPad's just moving on me, by KiwiSaver and managed funds companies that have a record of human rights violations, and surveys show this is an issue to most concern to the public. What do you think it will take to change investment practices?
I'll start because I've got the microphone in my hand. There's going to be human rights risks regardless of what investors do. So even the most well-meaning business is not going to be able to mitigate their risk completely. So it becomes an issue of identifying, doing the baseline of where the risks possibly are. And while I love tech tools and I love ethical voice and things, sometimes those tools, they don't put in the human element. So it's understanding actually where your risks are for your business, which one bank's risk will be different from another bank's risk, which is different from an insurer's risk. So understanding that risk, but also having the policies and procedures to address that and looking at the effectiveness. So there's no point putting in these policies and procedures, like you talked about, having this wonderful supplier agreement that you'd have to be B Corp to do. It's completely ineffective. There's no point in having it. So that's where the change is going to come, where we're looking at the full due diligence framework of policies and procedures, the operational side, but also that grievance mechanism, remedy, effectiveness testing. And so that's the reporting as well as the effectiveness. Investors do need to change, and it will change, but it'll take time. And I'm a firm believer of cross-sector collaboration. So it's not all on the private sector to do this. It's not all on the public sector to do this. It's not all on NGOs. We actually can't facilitate change across this unless there is collaboration across the sectors and a willingness to change. I mean, we all sit here with our iPhones and our smart devices. Do we have a willingness to change that behaviour? Because we know how we're getting those devices. I'm going to go into a whole other topic of degrowth and sustainability and all these other things, but I think it's going to take a shift in the way we act and what we as humans are now used to in a global market to actually be able to change the risk to humans.
Yeah, it's tricky. I think there's a parallel with decarbonising portfolios as well, which is if you've got a directive to decarbonise your portfolio, you go, okay, I'm not going to invest in fossil fuels. There's plenty of capital out there investing in fossil fuels. So a better result is you're able to have a highly transparent conversation with the investee entity to say, hey, we don't like this. This is on your watch. What are you going to do about it? Because otherwise we'll defect. Right, as opposed to invisibly just winking out of existence as a provider of capital for that organisation, and changing nothing in their behaviour. So you've just kind of removed yourself from that risk, but you haven't actually injected any change. There are companies like I think Morrison's probably is one that I'd call out. They invest in infrastructure. They have an exceptionally strong sustainability policy for their investment managers. It's kind of below the fold. They don't sell themselves as a sustainable investment manager because in some markets that actually is not attractive to the capital providers that they're trying to attract. But their sort of refrain is, look, it's much better for us to invest in infrastructure businesses which are pretty dusty, like across the kind of ESG landscape. Some of those businesses, they're high emitting, they've got pretty rusty workforce safety issues, and use our capital to actually get them along and turn them into more contemporary businesses across that landscape and make them perform better as an investment, than for us to invest in areas where we're not going to be able to generate that amount of positive change.
Sorry, I'm just going to plug things there. It's also understanding our New Zealand's way of living and what we might want to invest in isn't necessarily a global standard. So when we talk about modern slavery, we talk about one of the types of modern slavery is the worst forms of child labour. That doesn't involve all child labour, because while we might not agree in New Zealand that child labour is something that is ever okay, in some countries it's a reality, and that's going to sometimes be within our supply chains. The age of a child is different in different jurisdictions. So it's also, when we're looking at the investment, the investment sector is not imparting one rule or one restriction. It's understanding as a whole what are the rules and regulations we should be imparting. So with climate, it's quite, we talk about carbon, we talk about emissions. The human element is harder than that. So I think there is global talk about global reporting for the S. The biggest question of that is, what does it include, what does it not include, and what are the actual measures of it? So I think it's going to be a long road, but one that we have to keep continuing talking about to have that investor change.
Yes, and I think the cheesy expression, it's a marathon, not a sprint, is so appropriate for this work. The word that comes to mind for me, and again, not to be too obvious, but actually, again, is education. I just still think there's some sort of myths associated with ESG that continually need to be busted. And if we're working in this space in our organisations, we shouldn't assume that our senior leaders, our board members, necessarily are in the same weeds that we are with this work, and it's our job to communicate really clearly how everything that we're talking about today is incredibly relevant to the profitability of our business and the way that we operate with a long-term as well as a short-term lens, because that actually puts us in a room for conversation where we're much more all on the same page, as opposed to perhaps general misunderstandings across all stakeholders that ESG is corporate social responsibility, where we just donate to charities. It's completely not, and we've covered a big reason for that is today. I think also there's hope with this, right, in terms of on the same note of education. We have got a lot more understanding now within the different stakeholders of society about how the dots are being drawn on this and New Zealand's relevance to it. And to me, that is a hopeful thing. And I've now worked specifically in the area of modern slavery for 8 years for NGOs, the government, and the private sector. And as Gemma said, the partnership element is so key to this, and educating each other on what that partnership element looks like and how to practically do it is kind of the next step to implement it. But I don't think we should be naive and say it's without challenge, because it absolutely is. And that's why I hope we're all here, that we're up for it.
Thank you.
Any further questions, Carissa?
There are some, and some I would love to ask because they're really thought-provoking. Unfortunately, I need to call time. But carrying on your note, Rebecca, about education, I am going to do a plug for the FSC's Climate and ESG Committee. You've seen at the beginning Rebecca Armstrong from World Vision. She is going to be one of our guests for September. So connect in with your person in your organisation who's on the committee, or reach out to me to be on it. Thank you so much for today. I've learnt lots, and I helped be part of organising these sessions, so I certainly hope you all have too. Head out now to the main foyer area for afternoon tea, and hit up our panellists if you've got more questions. Thank you so much.